All right, so let's get right into it. We're diving deep into UFC fighter pay today, something I know a lot of you are really curious about.
Definitely a hot topic.
It's been all over online recently, and you know what sparked it? John Makdessi, former UFC fighter.
Oh, yeah.
He shared his payslip after a fight in Australia, and it's really got people talking about how much these fighters are actually making when they put it all on the line, in the octagon.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating look behind the scenes. We usually just see the big pay-per-view events and the hype around the big names.
Exactly.
This payslip gives us a glimpse into the financial realities for the fighters who aren't, household names.
Right, so let's break this payslip down. This is John Makdessi, 20 fights in the UFC, not a rookie stepping into the cage for the first time. His gross pay for this fight was $58,000.
Which, on the surface, you might think, okay, that's a decent amount.
Right, it sounds like a lot. But then you see the deductions, starting with taxes, 45%, gone right off the top. That's a huge difference from other major sports, where athletes often have benefits, employer contributions, to kind of offset those costs.
Yeah, it really highlights the difference in the financial landscape for these fighters.
And it doesn't stop there. They also deduct airfare and medicals directly from his pay, which surprised a lot of people.
Wow.
It makes you think about who's really responsible for the costs associated with a fighter's health and their ability to compete.
It definitely raises some questions about, the UFC's financial responsibility towards its athletes, especially when you consider those are essential expenses, directly related to their performance.
So after taxes and those deductions, Makdessi's net pay for putting his body on the line comes out to around $28,000.
Right.
And we haven't even factored in all the other expenses yet.
All the other expenses,
Yeah.
right? Like training camp costs, coaching fees, gym fees,
Yeah.
It all adds up.
It adds up quick.
I saw some people online estimating that a fighter might actually only net about $10,000 after covering everything.
Wow, that's crazy when you think about the risks involved in this sport. To put this into perspective, I want to bring you in here to compare this to other major sports leagues. We found some interesting data on revenue sharing, the percentage of league revenue that goes to the players.
Yeah, the differences are pretty striking. So in the NBA, MLB, and NFL players receive around 49 to 51% of the revenue generated. And even the MLS, which is a much younger league, sits at a surprising 76%.
Wow, those are some significant numbers.
They are. And then you look at the UFC, where fighters receive about 18% of the revenue.
That's a massive gap.
Yeah.
What factors contribute to this huge disparity?
Well, a major one is unionization. Most major sports leagues have strong players' unions that collectively bargain for, better pay benefits and working conditions. The UFC, however, does not.
So UFC fighters are basically on their own when it comes to negotiating with the organization.
Pretty much. And it's also important to remember that the UFC is still relatively young compared to those established leagues we mentioned.
So there's less history of, player empowerment and collective bargaining.
Exactly. But even with that, consider, the UFC's age, that difference in revenue sharing is hard to ignore. And it leads us to another key point, the classification of UFC fighters as independent contractors.
Right. That's something that sparked a lot of discussion online. Could you unpack that for us? What does being an independent contractor really mean for these fighters?
So essentially, it means they lack the benefits and protections that typically come with being an employee. No health insurance, no retirement plans, and they're responsible for their own taxes.
That's a pretty raw deal when you think about the physical demands and the risks they face every time they step into the octagon.
It is. And here's where it gets even more complicated. While they're classified as independent contractors, UFC fighters are also bound by exclusivity clauses in their contracts.
So they can't fight for other organizations.
Exactly. That lack of freedom to pursue other opportunities kind of contradicts the typical flexibility associated with being an independent contractor.
It paints a pretty complicated picture of their employment status, for sure. And when you factor in all the expenses they have to cover, it makes you wonder, why do they do it? Why dedicate your life to a sport that seems to offer such limited financial security?
That's a question that goes to the heart of what motivates these athletes. For many, it's the pure passion for the sport, the drive to compete at the highest level.
The love of the game, pushing their limits. That definitely resonates, especially for those who might not be in it solely for the money.
Right, but there's also this interesting perspective that Dana White, the UFC president, often pushes. He frames fighting in the UFC as an opportunity, not necessarily a long-term career.
Opportunity. That's
Yeah.
a loaded term. What are your thoughts on that?
It does raise questions about how the UFC views its fighters and their long-term well-being. Is it just a temporary platform for them to showcase their skills, or is there a responsibility to support their careers and lives beyond the octagon?
especially when you think about the physical toll this sport takes on their bodies. What stood out to you from the online discussions about the global disparity in fighter pay?
Well, one interesting point is that while $28,000 might not seem like a lot in the US, it goes a lot further in countries like Dagestan or Brazil, where the cost of living is lower.
Yeah, and we do see a large number of top fighters coming from those regions.
Exactly. So the UFC might represent a more significant financial opportunity for fighters from those countries compared to fighters from wealthier nations.
It adds another layer to the discussion about motivations and financial realities within the UFC. And speaking of different perspectives, we saw a lot of comments about unionization. What are the chances of UFC fighters actually forming a union and collectively bargaining for better pay and conditions?
It's a complex issue with significant obstacles. For starters, Dana White has been very vocal in his opposition to a fighters' union.
And his influence within the organization is undeniable. What other challenges do you see?
Uniting fighters from diverse backgrounds with varying levels of success and, different priorities can be a major hurdle.
Right, we saw a range of opinions online, some strongly advocating for unionization, others skeptical about its feasibility.
It's a debate that's likely to continue as the sport evolves and fighters continue to grapple with the financial realities of their profession. But this whole conversation makes you wonder, beyond the immediate fight purses and the short-term gains, what about the long-term implications?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We see the knockouts, the submissions, the brutal battles, but we don't always think about the physical and mental toll it takes on these athletes. What happens to them after they retire?
It's a crucial question that the UFC doesn't seem to have a clear answer for.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking potential brain injuries, joint damage, chronic pain. These are serious long-term health risks that fighters face.
Yeah, we can't forget about the mental and emotional stress that comes with competing at such a high level.
Absolutely. The pressure to perform, the constant threat of injury, the uncertainty of their next paycheck, it all takes a toll.
Yeah, it seems like that narrative of fighting as an opportunity, as Dana White puts it, needs to be balanced with, a greater sense of responsibility for the well-being of these athletes.
I agree. Other major sports leagues have programs in place to help retired athletes transition to new careers, manage their health, address financial challenges. The UFC seems to be lagging behind in that regard.
It's almost like the independent contractor classification allows the UFC to sidestep those long-term responsibilities.
It's definitely a possibility that warrants further examination. This whole conversation really highlights the ethical considerations surrounding fighter pay.
A lot of commenters online brought up the psychological impact of constantly worrying about money. Imagine trying to train, strategize, and mentally prepare for a fight while knowing that one loss could mean a major financial setback.
It's a level of pressure that most people can't even comprehend, and that financial stress can spill over into their personal lives, affecting their relationships, the families.
Yeah. Some commenters mentioned how fighters often rely on spouses, parents, or friends to help cover training costs, travel expenses, all the other fight-related costs.
That's right. It plays a huge burden not just on the fighter, but on their entire support system.
So when we talk about fair fighter pay, it's not just about a comfortable lifestyle. It's about mental well-being, stable relationships, long-term security.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the human side of the sport, the sacrifices these athletes make, and the risks they take.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From analyzing John Makdessi's payslip to comparing revenue sharing across different sports leagues, we unpacked the complexities of the independent contractor debate, explored the diverse motivations of fighters, and discussed the challenges they face, particularly those who aren't at the top of the pay scale. But there's one more aspect I want to touch on.
What's that?
Social media. It's become such a huge part of the sports world, and it seems to be playing an increasingly significant role in the financial landscape of the UFC.
You're right. Social media has given fighters a platform to build their personal brands, connect with fans, and attract sponsorships, which can be a significant source of income outside of their fight purses.
We've seen fighters amass huge followings, become influencers, and even launch their own businesses. It's fascinating to see how they're leveraging these platforms to create opportunities for themselves.
Yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers fighters a potential path to financial stability and greater control over their careers. But on the other hand, it creates pressure to constantly engage with fans, build a following, and generate content, which can be incredibly demanding and time-consuming.
And we can't forget about the potential downsides of social media, such as online harassment, negativity, and the pressure to maintain a certain image.
That's a valid point. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. But despite the challenges, social media has undoubtedly changed the game for UFC fighters, giving them more leverage and a platform to connect with a wider audience.
It'll be interesting to see how this aspect of the sport continues to evolve and whether it can contribute to a more sustainable and equitable financial model for fighters.
Absolutely. It's something we should definitely keep an eye on.
So we've explored the immediate financial realities, the long-term implications, and the evolving landscape of social media.
Mm.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question. We've talked about, the UFC's responsibility, but what about us? What about our responsibility as fans? Knowing what we now know about fighter pay and the challenges they face, how does that, how should that inform the way we engage with this sport? What can we do to support these athletes beyond just, tuning in for the fights?
That's a great question. And I think, as fans, we have more power than we might realize. Our viewership, our ticket purchases, our engagement on social media, it all sends a message to
Right.
the UFC.
So we're not just passive observers, we're part of this whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And that means we have a responsibility to, be informed, to think critically about the issues surrounding fighter pay, and to advocate for, changes that benefit these athletes.
Like, what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, supporting those who speak out about the need for fairer pay is a big one. Amplifying their voices, sharing their stories, putting pressure on the organization to address those concerns.
So it's about holding the UFC accountable, not just for, the entertainment they provide, but for the well-being of the fighters who make it all possible.
Right, exactly. And, we can also support efforts to establish a fighters association or a union, which would give them more leverage in negotiations and a stronger voice in shaping their own destinies.
And beyond that, on the organizational level, we can also support fighters directly.
Absolutely. Engaging with their social media, supporting their sponsors, purchasing their merchandise. These are all tangible ways to show our appreciation and to, contribute to their financial well-being.
It's about recognizing that these are human beings who are dedicating their lives to this sport, often at great personal cost.
Yeah, and ensuring they're treated with the respect and dignity they deserve both inside and outside the octagon. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's clear that fighter pay in the UFC is a complex issue with no easy solutions.
Yeah, sure.
But it's an issue that demands our attention, our critical thinking, and our willingness to, engage in these conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As fans of the sport, we have a responsibility to be informed and to advocate for a future where the UFC is not only a platform for thrilling fights, but also a model for athlete empowerment and fair treatment.
Well said. It's about the evolution of the sport.
It really is. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating exploration of a topic that clearly resonates with a lot of people, and I hope it's left you with some food for thought.
Absolutely it has. It's a conversation that needs to continue.
It definitely does. Until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on. And remember, every time you step into the octagon of knowledge, you come out a champion.